میں سہارا بس ولائے آل احمد ہے، وسیلہ ہے تیرا پرچم حسین جانا ترا دارا، جتن لیتی ہے شاید انتہا ہم سے، کہ قاتل مانگتا ہے زندگی ہم سے، یہ جا ہم سے ولا ہوگی نہ دل سے کم حسین جانا ترا دارا، کہانی اسر حاضر کی رقم نوشاد نے کی ہے، سنو لبیک یا مہدی قلم کی نوک کہتی ہے، یہی واجد کہیں گے ہم حسین جانا ترا دارا،
سلام کعبه دلها حسین جان، سلام شمع محفلها حسین جانم، حسین جانم حسین جانم حسین جان، حسین جانم حسین جانم حسین جانم، سلام باب رحمت باب جنت، سلام باب رحمت باب جنت، سلام رهبر والا حسین جانم، سلام میوه قلب پیامبر، سلام میوه قلب پیامبر، سلام زاده زهرا حسین جانم، حسین جانم حسین جانم حسین جان، حسین جانم حسین جانم حسین جانم، همیشه بلبم نام تو باشم، همیشه بلبم نام تو باشم، همی گویم که ای مولا حسین جانم، غمت را از دل و جان میپذیرم، غمت را از دل و جان میپذیرم، کنم برپا
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله الذي يعلم عجيج الوحوش في الفلوات ومعاصي العباد في الخلوات واختلاف النينان في البحار الغامرات وتلاطم الماء بالرياح العاصفات، ثم السلام والصلاة على سيد الكائنات وأفضل أهل الأرضين والسماوات، سيدنا ونبينا أبي القاسم المصطفى محمد المبعوث بالمعجزات الباهرات والآيات البينات، وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين مصابيح الظلمات وعصم الأمة من الهلكات، الذين أذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا، ولا سيما بقية الله في الأرضين وحجته في العالمين، روحي وأرواح العالمين لتراب مقدمه فدا، واللعن الدائم على أعدائهم وغاصبي حقوقهم وجاحدي مناقبهم ومنكري فضائلهم من الآن إلى أبد الآبدين. فأعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أم لهم شركاء شرعوا لهم من الدين ما لم يأذن به الله، ولولا كلمة الفصل لقضي بينهم، وإن الظالمين لهم عذاب أليم. صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا، حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم الشريف. I extend my greetings of respect and peace to you. Assalamu alaikum. I pray to Almighty Allah to bless our hearts with the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. I pray to Almighty Allah to saturate our hearts with devotion, with faith, and with certitude for Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam and their excellent qualities. May Allah enable us and give us the capacity to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, to love Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and to serve their name and serve their cause. Our final discussions on the topic of taqleed, and I hope to conclude this discussion very soon, is addressed to this question today: how does a common person, ascertain and verify whether a specific hadith is reliable, credible? And this is a question that is used by those who promote taqleed in order to impede the Shia and discourage the Shia from following the sayings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Obviously, it is not possible for the mujtahideen and for those scholars and preachers who want to advance taqleed and who want to persuade the Shia of the legitimacy of taqleed. It is not possible for them to outright discourage the Shia from following hadith, to prohibit Shia from following the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, because that would be so horrible, and that would be so hideous, and that would be so reprehensible to any Shia, and any Shia would be appalled by any such suggestion that anybody would prohibit him and forbid him from following the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam. Therefore, it is not possible for the jurists and those preachers who serve the cause of the jurists to convince you or to outrightly um, prohibit you from following hadith. So they have to do this in an indirect manner. They have to do this not outwardly, but indirectly, and they have to conceal their true words with certain other concerns. So they approach you in this manner and they tell you, how could you follow hadith? And as a matter of fact, our books of hadith are full of fake hadith. Our books of hadith are full of unreliable hadith, and it is not possible for a common person to distinguish and differentiate between credible hadith and fake hadith or unreliable hadith. And if that is the case, if it's not possible for you to do that, how can you follow the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam? And this leads them to another false conclusion. And that other false consequence that they try to deduce from this argument is, since it's not possible for you to distinguish between credible hadith and non-credible hadith, you have to follow the words of mujtahid. You have to do taqleed. You have to follow his fatwa. Now, this may seem like a justified and a honest concern by mujtahideen. However, that's not the case. Mujtahideen are not concerned about the fact that you would follow wrong hadith and you would be misled and you would go astray because our books of hadith are full of false hadith. That is not their concern. Their primary concern is, if you follow hadith, then it would mean that you have abandoned taqleed, and that would bring down the house of marji'iyah. That would bring down the institution of marji'iyah on its feet, because marji'iyah is relevant as long as you are doing taqleed. And when you abandon taqleed, and when you are following the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, then marji'iyah becomes irrelevant. Marji'iyah would lose all its utility in the Shia world. That is their primary concern. And first and foremost, this question that our books of hadith, this premise, this supposition that our books of hadith are such that all sorts of ahadith have been compiled, and credible and weak ahadith, true hadith and fake hadith, they have been mixed up in a way that a common person cannot distinguish between them. And it takes decades of studies, decades of research, and decades of tutelage under grandmasters in the seminaries in order to be able to differentiate between all these sorts of ahadith. This understanding, first and foremost, it is a question that is posed against our madhab. That would be a blemish if it's indeed that's the case. It would be a bane on our madhab, on the Shiism itself. That which kind of a madhab is this? They claim, we Shia, or if I was to articulate this criticism from the perspective of a non-Shia, it would go as follows. Shia claim that they follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. However, when you go to their books, they themselves admit that their books are full of lies. They themselves admit that their books are not sahih like our books. Their books contain ahadith that are weak. Their books contain ahadith that are fake. Their books contain ahadith that are not credible. And there is no way for Shia, except through studies of many, many years, 40 years, 50 years in the seminary, to even identify the credible words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. So this is first and foremost a weak point, if it's true, against our madhab, against our denomination. And then not only that, it is a question that rises against the infallibility of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And that is because Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam prophesied time and again that the 12th Imam alayhi salam will have a long occultation. Rather, he will have two occultations, and the second one will be very long. So much so that many people would be confused and they would go astray and they would exit the religion because of the confusion, because of the misguidance that would prevail at the time of, uh, of, of the second occultation. And not only that, even during the time of the presence of the holy Imams alayhimussalam, their public presence, even in those times, Shia need to follow the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhimussalam. In holy Imams alayhimussalam, the noble Imams alayhimussalam, in their positions as divinely guided leaders for all mankind who are responsible for providing guidance not only for the Shia, but to make it available for any person in the world. And on the other hand, we know that guidance is restricted. Guidance is found only and only within the sayings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, within the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. When you remember these two premises, that on the one hand, Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam are responsible for the guidance of their Shia and the guidance of mankind as a whole. And guidance is only found, true religious guidance is found only in the sayings of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam. And on the other hand, they have told us that a long night of occultation, a dark period of occultation will come, and this will last many, many ages. So, why didn't they make any preparations for this, for the future generations of the Shia, future generations of mankind, who want to find divine guidance and the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam? If this is the condition of Shia madhab today, that despite having all these scholars throughout history, their books of hadith are such mix-up, hodgepodge of fake and true hadith, reliable and non-reliable hadith, where were the 12 Imams? Where were these infallible individuals? Where were these people invested with infallibility from Allah, invested with treasures of knowledge and guidance and illumination from Allah? Why did they didn't prophesy this day? And they talked about it. On the one hand, guidance is only found in their words, and they did not make sure that Shias and the coming generations would have reliable books of their words, reliable accounts of their instructions, so they will not go astray. So if this allegation by the jurists and those scholars who want to convince you to practice taqleed is true, which allegation? This suggestion that books of hadith are hodgepodges of mix-ups of all different sorts of hadith. Fake hadith, credible hadith, rational hadith, irrational hadith, hadith that are not reliable, hadith that are reliable, and we cannot differentiate between them. If this is true, this is first and foremost a bane, a blemish against our denomination. Second, it puts the knowledge of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, the infallibility of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salatu was-salam, and their farsighted into question, and their leadership into question, if that is the case. And thirdly, another question rises also, that since jurists say that it takes quite a specialization and quite an expertise, as they suggest, to distinguish between verifiable ahadith and authentic ahadith and non-reliable ahadith, true hadith and fake hadith. After passage of all these centuries, if they are indeed concerned, if that is true, that they are concerned that Shia might follow, common Shia might follow fake hadith or unreliable hadith or irrational hadith, hadith that have been, according to them, they have been inserted in our books by the enemies of this madhab. If they're concerned about this, that Shia would follow such a hadith and they would go astray, if that is indeed the case, well, after passage of all these centuries, why haven't they produced books that comprise reliable hadith? Why haven't they authored books that differentiate between ahadith that are reliable and ahadith that are not reliable? Umaris, we know they follow Abu Bakr and Omar, and we have no specific respect neither for Abu Bakr, nor for Omar, nor for Aisha, nor for Uthman. And these people, these individuals, Abu Bakr, Omar, Uthman, founders of the Umari faith, were neither known for their knowledge, neither were known for their piety, nor would they ever claimed that they were appointed by the divine to lead mankind until eternity, right? Yet they have books of hadith that they concur by their consensus that these books of hadith are Sahih, Bukhari, Muslim, and some other books. So why that doesn't exist in the Shia order? If indeed, if we were to believe the mujtahideen, that mujtahideen are indeed concerned and mujtahideen are indeed worried that Shia might follow the wrong sets of hadith. Why this question rises? Why their mujtahideen's number is not few? If you go to Iran, there are hundreds of thousands of people who are studying in the Hawza, and that's just today. And if you go decades back, there were thousands of people. You go decades back, and their chain of Hawza goes back for centuries, and they always had good resources and good talented people. Why they didn't produce any such thing? So this premise that Shia books of hadith are so weak and so unreliable and so bad and so miserable that they comprise every sort of hadith is such a bad suggestion. It puts the madhab into question. It puts imama into question, and also it gives rise to a question which the mujtahideen cannot answer, that why you didn't produce any such works, right? And also why these great authors such as Al-Kulaini, such as Shaykh al-Saduq, Shaykh Muhammad ibn Farrukh al-Saffar, Shaykh Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Barqi, Shaykh such as Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi, all these great authors who were living in the time of Al-Ghaiba al-Sura, and they had the honor of meeting many companions of the holy Imams alayhim salam, and they had at their disposal many books that were written under the eyes of the Imams alayhim salam, and these books were produced and shown to the Imams alayhim salam, and they had testified, the Imams alayhim salam, that these books are credible. So these books that were written by the students of the holy Imams alayhim salam under the guardianship of the holy Imams alayhim salam, when they were living at that time, why? What would cause them to have all these credible ahadith at their disposal, yet write books that comprise fake hadith, that comprise weak hadith, unreliable hadith, irrational hadith, and some true ahadith? Why? When I write a book for you, especially if I say in the prologue of my book that I'm writing this book for the generations to come to follow the true path of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam through credible ahadith. That is my objective. That is my commitment. Yet when I write the book, and I can do that, I can fulfill that commitment because I have all these books at my disposal, right? Yet when I write the book, I put every sort of hadith in their book. Why would they do that, such a thing? Let me give you a brief history of how hadith was compiled in the Shia faith, Shia denomination. It is very different. The history of hadith and the Shia denomination is very different and distinct from the history of compilation of hadith and the Umari denomination. The holy Imams alayhim salatu wassalam were truly divinely appointed individuals who were really concerned about the guidance of their Shia and guidance of mankind as a whole. And this is not just my claim that religious guidance, true religious guidance, is only and only found in hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam. This is the position of Allah. This is the position of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. This is the statement of Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam, that true religious guidance is found only in the words of Ahlul Bayt alayhim assalam. On the one hand, they are invested with divine knowledge. And on the other hand, they are concerned and they are worried and they want to take care of their Shia. They want to make sure their Shia are always bestowed with sufficient guidance, and they know the ghaibat is coming, occultation is coming. Therefore, the holy Imams alayhim salam from the early days, one of their most important matters that occupied them was to spend time with individuals who would write their hadith, and they would dictate hadith on various topics, not just furu' ad-din, not just questions of halal and haram, but also secrets of creation, attributes of God, proofs of God's existence, the history of Quran, seerah of the Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, what are the proofs of imama, what are the characteristics and attributes and various aspects of personalities of an imam, what are the proofs of imama of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, and why the enemies of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, the usurpers of Fadak, the thieves of Saqifa, they are not entitled to imama, and what is going to happen when a person dies, and what is going to happen when after a person arises from his death on the Day of Judgment. All these matters in great details, the Imams alayhim salatu wassalam made sure that they are written from their words and by their companions. And these were thousands of books. This is not a joke. This is a grand accomplishment. After Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam died, people who overtook the realm of Islam, people who overtook the leadership of Islam, they didn't care about Islam. They couldn't care less about Quran or Sunnah or Sharia. Islam crashed. A new religion was born that was distorted in every way. Its tawheed had been distorted. Its acts of worship had been distorted. Islam had become a tool, a knife in the hands of those criminals who wanted to loot the world, conquer the world. That was Islam, and that Islam became that, just a tool to serve the government, to serve the Khilafah, to serve Arab conquests. It was the holy Imams of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salatu wasalam who revived Ahlul Bayt, who revived Islam, who revived the teachings of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam by these books. And these books were present in our books of hadith. And for generations, these books were present. And our books of hadith are written and copied from those books of hadith. The Kulaini, the Kafi of Kulaini, Man la yahdharuhu al-faqih of Saduq, Tafsir of Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi, Tafsir of Ayyashi, Tafsir of Furat al-Kufi, Kitab al-Mahasin of Ahmad ibn Khalid al-Barqi, Kitab al-Ghayba of Ni'mani, the books of Shaykh al-Saduq, many books. All these books have been written from those books. So they are very credible. These books have not been narrated, these hadith have not been narrated orally. Oral narration doesn't have credibility. You hear something, and now you're going to, that hearsay, the something that you heard, after 10 years, you're going to narrate that to someone else. And then that person who heard you say this statement, he heard you just orally, right? He is going to quote you somewhere else after another 20 years. And then another person is going to quote him after another 20, 30 years. And then another person. This such oral transmission doesn't have any credibility. You know that. That's very obvious. That doesn't have any more value than a hearsay. So Umari hadith, no matter what they do, has no more credibility than hearsay. There are some things in Umari hadith that have been narrated repeatedly through many different chains of narration. So it's something that was well known, many people. Other than that, other than those matters that are well known, that have been repeatedly narrated, all the other hadith have no credibility just for the fact that they were narrated orally. Oral tradition of narration. The human being is not perfect in his memory. We all know that. That's proven. That when we hear something, we do not hear everything completely. And even if we pay attention, hear everything completely, we do not retain those words. We do not retain those words in memory for a long period of time. And then when you add decades, rather centuries, and generation after generation after generation, hearsay after hearsay after hearsay, that doesn't allow for any credibility, any meaningful credibility for the Umari hadith. On the other hand, Shia method of transmission of hadith, something is written in the presence of the Holy Imam alayhi salam, and or sometimes the Holy Imams alayhi salam would write themselves and they would give it to their companions. And then those books were sources that were used by Kulaini and the rest to compile their books of hadith. And why does Kulaini mention chain of narration? He doesn't mention chain of narration because he orally, that any person, this is the well-known fact about Shia history of hadith. Now, our mujtahideen do not know these things because they never study hadith. Majority of them do not know this. Some of them do know. Kulaini mentions these because this was at that time, mentioning sanad had become a tradition. Mentioning sanad had become customary because the Umaris did that. Because amongst muhaddithin, they would mention their chain of teachers. Although he is narrating from this book was written by Zurara, and Zurara wrote it at the time of Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam. And Kulaini has this book, and he has the book of other students of the Imam alayhi salam, and he could cross-reference them, and he could authenticate in so many different ways to make sure this hadith is indeed the words of Imam alayhi salatu wassalam. Why does he mention chain of narration? Because that was customary at that time. That when this book, because teachers would give permission to their students to narrate the whole book. And then he would give narration, permission to narrate, ijaza, to narrate the whole book. So just as today, I have a chain of narration, all the way to Kulaini, all the way to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, right? Because I have permission to narrate hadith. However, if I mention my chain of narration until Kulaini, it doesn't have any significance at all. Because we know that this book of Al-Kafi is from Kulaini, is by Kulaini, was written by Kulaini. So even if I mention my chain of narration, that I was permitted by this person, and he was permitted by this person, and from this person, until go to Kulaini, that doesn't make any difference. Likewise, Kulaini from Al-Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salatu wassalam. So these ahadith are at the highest level of credibility. Now, true, there are some ahadith that conflict with other ahadith. But it doesn't mean these ahadith were not transmitted by the holy Imams alayhim assalam. Pay attention. People who study in the houses do not know many of these things. And they will tell you wrong things. They say there could not be inconsistency between the words of Imams alayhim assalam. That is wrong. That's erroneous. There is significant amount of inconsistency, intentional inconsistency, design inconsistency between the words of the holy Imams alayhim assalam. And that was for a purpose. That was a strategy that served the survival of the Shia at that time. The holy Imams alayhim assalatu wassalam, because animus against Shia, sensitivity of governments against Shia was so intense that at any time there could be a widespread crackdown on Shia, a widespread extermination of Shia could be carried out by these vast empires. This was no joke. Banu Umayyah, Bani Abbas, they were superpowers of their time. There has been very few empires throughout history who have been greater, vaster than the empire of Bani Umayyah. Do you know that? Only two empires have been greater and bigger in terms of their spread, their vastness, their expansion than Bani Umayyah. The British Empire, the British Empire was the fastest empire because they occupied parts of China, India, Africa, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, United States, a few states at the first, and then also their home island of UK, right? And then that was a vast one, but it was all spread out, different areas. It was not one contiguous piece of land, not like Bani Umayyah. And the second one was the Mughal Empire, the Mongolian Empire. They rose from the steppes of Mongolia, and they conquered most of Asia, and they conquered all the way to Poland. So that was a very vast empire. However, after them, Bani Umayyah's empire was the fastest. And at that time, there was no other superpower in the world who could challenge Bani Umayyah. And if they wanted, they could conquer more, but they couldn't control, because Bani Umayyah's caliphs, they were mostly indulged with their own worldly pleasures, so they could not conquer more than they had already conquered. And Bani Abbas the same way. They were, at their time, they were unchallenged superpowers of the world. And their armies were not tens of thousands. Their armies were hundreds of thousands. And Shia were small minorities in Kufa, in Medina, in Qum. And if the government felt at any time that Shia are a risk for them, or Shia pose a danger for them, they wouldn't joke. They wouldn't hesitate for a second to eradicate the Shia from the face of the earth. Every tribe that was suspected of being Shia, every person that was being suspected of Shia, to destroy them all. That is why the holy Imams والسلام, at that time, in those days, it was a question of survival of the Shia. A strategy. The Shia indeed considered the caliph illegitimate. And the caliphs knew that Shia view the caliphs as illegitimate people occupying the seat of leadership. They knew that's the belief of the Shia. And they also knew that Shia believed the true Imam is Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam, Imam Zain al-Abidin alayhi salam, or Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam, depending on the time. They also knew that. However, why they wouldn't crack down on the Shia? Because they saw Shia as weak. They saw Shia as insignificant. Rather, they were more concerned about the Zaydis, because Zaydis were a greater source of conflict. They were a greater source of challenge. And it were the Zaydis who would time and again would rise up against the caliphs, and they would lead revolts and rebellions against the caliphs. However, the Shia, Imamiyya Shia, no. Imamiyya Shia were considered weak and insignificant, although their beliefs, if they were empowered, there would be a challenge for the caliph. Nonetheless, the caliphs did not consider them worthy of eradicating, because they were busy, occupied with more other pressing issues. At this time, it was very important for the survival of the Shia that the government, that the regimes, they continue to view Shia as insignificant, to continue to view Shia as a small, insignificant, weak minority that will never be capable of leading any revolt, any rebellion against Shia. So what was one of those ways? One of those ways was that Shia dispute each other on different matters. So a person comes, asks a question about Salah, prayers, Imam alayhi salam would answer him in a specific way. And in the same majlis, in the same session, another person would come and ask Imam alayhi salam about Salah, Imam alayhi salam would answer a different way. A third person comes and answers a third way. So this would lead the Shia to have to be following, they're following the same Imam. And the same Imam is giving different sorts of instructions for different individuals. And this causes what? And causes the Shia to be differing from one another. And this would cause the Shia not to seem as a very organized cult, a very organized minority. That could be a challenge for the Caliph. And when the Caliph sees that the Shia, they are disputing amongst themselves on the question of time of Salah or the questions of rituals of various kinds, they would, because caliphs, they had spies everywhere, and the governors, various governors, they kept an eye on the Shia. They would report to the Caliph that Shia are not to be worried about, and that was a strategy that saved madhab, saved the Shia, saved Shiism, saved this faith, saved this denomination. So the Imams alayhim salatu wasalam, on purpose, they gave conflicting instructions, and they told their Shia that we are giving you conflicting instructions, and this is for your own survival. Otherwise, you will be obliterated, and we will be obliterated. And Imams alayhim salam said that. So that was a strategy. So there are conflicting ahadith in our books, but that was the reason. It's not, and this is what I'm telling you, this is hadith, more than one hadith of Ahlul Bayt alayhim salam, that they on purpose, they issued conflicting hadith, conflicting instructions, and the holy Imams alayhim salam told us what to do when conflicting ahadith reach us, what to do and what should we do. So there's no, these books of hadith are extremely credible and reliable, and the ahadith are sahih. Nonetheless, there are conflicting ahadith therein, and the holy Imams alayhim salam have given. And these conflicting ahadith doesn't mean there is the contradiction is because the ahadith are fake. No, this has another reason. And the Imams alayhim salam have given instructions how to solve the conflict and inconsistency between these ahadith. And then inshallah I'll explain that in a different session. Now, how does a person verify? How does a person verify whether the hadith is sahih? How does a person satisfies his heart that a hadith that he wants to follow has been transmitted by the holy Imams alayhim salam? Now I explained to you that our books are very credible. Now this explanation could be expounded further, and I could go into further detail, inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala. If one day that is necessary, I'll do that. However, what I explained to you clarifies many things. And inshallah tabaraka wa ta'ala, if you follow the leads that I've provided to you, you would find my assertions are right and valid. With regard to answer to this question, even if we assume that the assertion of the mujtahideen is correct, which is not correct. And that assertion is that books of hadith are mixed up of hadith that are fake and hadith that are true, hadith that are reliable and hadith that are not reliable. Even if we accept that, how do you satisfy your heart that this hadith that you want to follow is credible? I mentioned to you that a common person who wants to follow hadith, there is no other way for him except to deliberate with a scholar, learn from a scholar. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to go meet a person or attend a person's lecture or watch his videos. Learning from a scholar means that you do it in person or through his video, and also could mean his books. If a scholar has a book, now he translates hadith, and then he explains hadith, and it helps me understand the meaning of the hadith, and helps me understand the complexity of any hadith. That is just as good as if I go in person and learn from that scholar. That's just as good. There's not much difference between the two. Provided that the scholar is the 5 qualities that the Imam alayhi salatu wasalam mentioned in the hadith that I recited to you from the book of Tafsir of Imam al-Hasan al-Askari alayhi salam. The scholar, he has to be knowledgeable, number one. فَأَمَّا مَنْ كَانَ مِنَ الْفُقَهَا. Knowledgeable. Number two, he has to fear Allah. Number three, he حافظا لدينه. He has to be a guardian of religion. He has to be a soldier of religion. He has to be a defender of the faith. Number four, he has to be مطيعا لأمر مولاه. He has to be in total submission to Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. Number five, مخالفا لهواه. He has to oppose his lust. He has that lust which involves haram. He has to oppose all of that. So when he has these five qualities, then his explanation of any hadith, his translation of any hadith is credible, and you should accept it. When we, the common Shia, we need to go to scholars, right, to understand hadith, right? Even if we accept that books of hadith are there are a mix-up of wrong and credible and non-credible hadith, then when we go to scholars, we have to go to scholars or their books anyways in order to understand hadith. Even these hadith that are all good, that are all reliable, right? If you give me a book of hadith, all its hadith are reliable. If I'm a common person, I cannot read Arabic. If I can read Arabic, perhaps I cannot understand everything. Therefore, I need exegesis, I need interpretation, I need translation, I need simplification. I need a book of hadith for dummies. So this person who's writing hadith for dummies, he's simplifying hadith for me. Likewise, he can give testimony that this hadith is sahih, this hadith is not sahih. So, and as long as I have confidence in his knowledge and his piety, as long, not as a matter of taking his word for granted. No one's word is taken for granted. No one person's word is hujjah except the 14 infallible ones. As long as I'm confident and he has these qualities that I just mentioned, 5 qualities, why can't, there's no reason. A common person cannot rely on his words. A common person cannot accept his words. That this person is a God-fearing scholar, such a Saduq or Kulaini or someone like him. He has written this book in English, Hadith for Dummies. And he mentions that this hadith is sahih. And he mentions the reason why this hadith is sahih. And that's why, if he explains that there's no reason why I cannot take this hadith as sahih, take this hadith as certainly stated by the Holy Imam alayhi salam. You understand what I'm saying? Therefore, this assertion by mujtahideen, we come back to the mujtahideen's assertion, those who want to convince you to do taqleed. They say you cannot follow hadith. Why I cannot follow hadith? Tell me, for God's sake. You say, oh, you cannot follow hadith because books of hadith, they're all mix-ups of wrong hadith and right hadith. Okay, that's not true. That is not true because I explained. Okay, even if it's true, let's say even if it's true, that doesn't prove taqleed. That doesn't prove that now I should follow the word of mujtahid. That if I have to follow hadith, I have to follow Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam. And the book of hadith that I have has some wrong hadith in them. The challenge before me is now how do I distinguish between the weak hadith, fake hadith, and the right hadith? How do I distinguish? That is the challenge. It doesn't mean I have to go follow another person as another person's opinions. It only means now how do I to verify that? And the easy way to verify that is through what? Through going to scholars, just because we have to go to scholars anyways in order to understand the meaning of hadith. Now this process of I go to this book of hadith for dummies, and hadith for dummies will explain to me whether a specific hadith is sahih or not. When I go there, this is practiced by mujtahideen themselves. And this is not so much that they could question as wrong, because grand mujtahideen, they themselves do that. They follow other individuals. They take their words and verifying whether a hadith is sahih or not. Let me show you some examples. This book is Al-Ijtihad wa Taqlid. written by Rida al-Sadr, published in 1976 in Beirut, Lebanon. Here, al-ijtihad wal-tajazzi, المتجزي في مبادئ الاجتهاد. A person who is not fully mujtahid, a person who is not fully a full researcher in all the prerequisites of ijtihad. One of the prerequisites of ijtihad is to be able to verify whether a hadith is credible or not. So if we have a person that he is not fully qualified in all prerequisites of ijtihad, he knows fiqh, he knows usul, he knows jurisprudence, he knows principles of jurisprudence, but if you give him all ahadith, he cannot verify all of the authenticity. So he is mutajazzi, he is a half mujtahid in the prerequisites of ijtihad. So such a person, is his ijtihad permissible? Is his ijtihad acceptable? Can he be followed? So he says, الشيخ العراقي, غزياء العراقي has stated in مقالات على عدم الجواز. A very respected scholar who passed away about 50 years ago, 70 years ago, غزياء الدين العراقي, is teacher of Abu al-Qasim al-Khui, he has stated, no, such a person, his ijtihad cannot be followed, and he cannot himself follow his own ijtihad. Why? Because his ijtihad is partial. His ijtihad is partial. Whether hadith is sahih or not, he has to ask somebody else. And when somebody else tells him a hadith is sahih, or he goes to another book and finds out the hadith is sahih, only then he can form his opinion on a juristic question, right? So all these matters that mujtahideen say, these are all their opinions, right? They're all theories. None of that is hadith, as you would understand. The author says, ويلزم من هذا الاحتجاج خروج أكابر المجتهدين عن دار الاجتهاد فإن كثيرا منهم غير مجتهدين في بعض ما يتوقف عليه الاستنباط كالعلوم العربية والمنطق والرجال. He says, this is so wrong. What Aghaziuddin al-Iraqi has stated is so obviously erroneous. Why? Because if we accept what he is saying, it would mean that senior mujtahideen are not mujtahid. It would mean خروج أكابر المجتهدين, the most akabir, the most respected, the most senior jurists would be kicked out of the house of ijtihad. They're not mujtahid. Why? Because many of them, a big plurality of the senior most mujtahideen, they themselves, they are not fully experts. They're not full experts in those sciences upon which ijtihad rely. They are not full experts in those sciences, and they rely on other people's opinions. And amongst them is al-rijal. Amongst those sciences of rijal. Rijal is the science according to which they verify whether hadith is sahih or not. So this is a clear assertion by Agha Rida al-Sadr that grand mujtahids, they themselves are muqallid in al-rijal, and whether hadith is sahih or not. They are muqallid. They do not have expertise, and they have to rely upon someone else's opinion, someone else's theory on that question. Yet there are grand mujtahids. So if grand mujtahids could follow another person's word, which he finds credible with regard to authenticity of hadith, why can't you? And this was a practice that was done at the times of the Holy Imams alayhim as-salam. In the times of the Holy Imams alayhim as-salam, as I explained in my previous lectures, there was no ijtihad, there was no fatwa, there was no taqleed. At that time, there were narrators of hadith. And these narrators of hadith in different villages and tribes, they would narrate hadith. They will teach hadith. They would provide hadith to the common person. And the common person will learn from them. And they would explain, this hadith is sahih. This hadith is reliable. They would explain, and people would, if they found his words credible, not that because he's hujjah, no. If his words were credible, they would, if they were confident about his knowledge and expertise, they would accept his as a matter of confidence. confidence in the word of a knowledgeable, God-fearing person. So this same method could be practiced today, could be practiced today, could be practiced today if one wants to follow the path of hadith. And the question is easier than that, really, because as I mentioned, our books of hadith are clean, our books of hadith are credible, our books of hadith are beyond reproach, especially the famous and respected books of hadith. And this question rises only if we succumb to the assertion of the mujtahideen, to the allegation of mujtahideen, which is that books of hadith are mixed up, or mix-ups of wrong and right hadith. So may Allah bless you all. May Allah keep you well. Thank you very much. Let's see if you have any questions. It seems like you have questions, right? I can display your questions from Facebook here, but YouTube I'll just read. I will not be able to display today YouTube comments. I'll not be able to display YouTube comments. Okay, let's see. Let's go Facebook. Okay. What's going on here? Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. If a person doesn't know how to create a hadith or distinguish between different chains, then how can one build their aqidah and beliefs from narrations? How does a lay person know what to believe and from narration when it comes to aqid or fiqh? Obviously, the answer to your question is that such a person relies upon expertise of other scholars. If he finds testimonies of scholars credible, that they testified that this hadith is sahih, and their reasons for this hadith sahih, then he accepts that that hadith is sahih. That's the only way. Very good reason that you mentioned. Very good point that you're mentioning. So the same could be done with regard to furu' ad-din. He says also, Asif Mohseni is half said to make a book authenticating narrations from Bihar. Have you seen this book? I've seen this book. Asif Mohseni is a very devious person and a very ignorant person. He died a couple of years ago. And a very ignorant person with regard to hadith. And that is tragedy. That is a tragedy that such people come and write books about hadith who do not know anything about hadith. And he is basically a mujtahid, the followers of the school of ijtihad, and they are enemies of hadith. And his book is an act of butchery with regard to Bihar al-Anwar. Shial goes, Sheikh, why so many speakers on the member quote any narration without really investigating them? Most Shias and many Muammams don't even check chains when quoting narrations apart from fiqh matters. So our scholars are not trained in hadith. They do not know anything. They do not know much about hadith. Majority of them, they do not know much about hadith. And the hadith that they quote you most of the time, they have heard themselves and from other memories, from other speakers on the member. So that's how they have memorized it, and that's how they quote them, really. So it happens very few times they actually check a hadith. That is quite common amongst people who speak on the members. Let me go to your YouTube. YouTube comments. So I cannot display YouTube comments today. I'll just read them here. So, Assalamu alaikum, dear brother Shimon Mirgos. As you may be aware, some scholars and historians, Fred Donner and Dan Gibson, have applied a new scientific approach to early Islam. The motivation of doing so is said to be the hundreds of years of gap between the time of Islamic traditions were written down in the period of the time that these traditions narrate, which is, okay, ... No, I'm not familiar with these individuals, and that is, I don't know their work. I don't understand their research. That is true about Umari Hadith. Umari Hadith, there's a big gap between the time they were written and the time that they were these hadith were transmitted by the Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So this lack of credibility with regard to these hadith, this is a very valid question, a very valid question. But this doesn't apply to the Shia hadith, because Shia hadith were written at the time of transmission. And that is a big difference. On the other hand, some of them say, I condemn you on the awareness of the true teaching of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam that you have been spreading worldwide. You commend me or you condemn me? Okay. On the other hand, some of them said he did exist. Who existed, brother? But but not in the way, the place, and time Muslims claim. Anyway, we'd be grateful if you could criticize and investigate their methods, since you are a well-known scholar and you have presented about the authenticity of hadith. Okay. Inshallah. I don't know these individuals. Okay, may Allah bless you. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad wa ajjil farajahum al-sharif. Allahumma kun libaliyika al-hujjat ibn al-Hasan salawatuka alayhi wa ala abaih في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد. Ya Ali Madad, may Allah bless you all.
ما میگن دیوونه اگه دیوونه شنیده ای به ما میگن دیوونه